All right, I guess we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. First session, very exciting. I'm just going to start by acknowledging that we're on unceded Gadigal land. As Wiradjuri, it's important for me to also acknowledge that I'm not in my own country and the music making that's been happening here for thousands of years. So our first presentation is Shane Lestedo. It's titled More Than Music, Creating a Multimedia Experience of Historical Australian Music. Shane is an Australian violinist with a passion for historical music and instruments. Renowned for her talents as a Baroque and classical violinist, she is also in demand as an artistic director, teacher, and music researcher. Shane's performing career has taken her across Europe and Australia, where she works regularly with the Australian Brandenburg Orchestra, Evergreen Ensemble, Melbourne Baroque Orchestra, Adelaide Baroque, and St John's Bach Orchestra. She has performed for, directed, and produced 2 albums of Scottish Australian repertoire for ABC Classic in 2019, and is preparing a 3rd in 2022, which is almost over. Currently a tutor in music history and Baroque ensemble studies at the University of Melbourne, Shane is also undertaking PhD studies on the historically informed performance of 19th century Scottish Australian music. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you very much. And can I say what an honour it is to be giving the first paper in the first edition of this wonderful symposium. We've just received a welcome to country, and I actually grew up in the heart of the Darug National Park, just up the road. So it feels very special to have been given that welcome to country, having just flown in from Geelong this morning. So I'm going to be talking today about creating or using multimedia as a way of experiencing historical Australian music. And I'll start with a little anecdote. So in mid-October of this year, just a few weeks ago, I was bringing a program of Scottish Australian fantasias for violin and piano to the Melbourne Recital Centre. And just as I do every time I play there, I reviewed the set list the night before we were due to perform. And as per usual, about half of the program needed updating, because in the year since I had submitted my proposal to the Recital Centre, I'd been working on my performance practice of this collection, and this had evolved my way of interacting with the collection, and about half of the pieces, had changed. The set list needed evolving too. But to be honest, it wasn't actually a problem, because absolutely nobody knew that repertoire and absolutely nobody knew the composer whose music I was playing. It really wasn't as if I'd, programmed Vivaldi's Four Seasons and come with the Bartók string quartet in its place. And that type of situation is something that I've become quite familiar with these days, because it's very common that audiences that come and hear my concerts are hearing these pieces for the very first time in their lives. And it does lead me to question then, why are they coming? Why would they come if they don't really know what they're going to get? And as I said, in my area of specialization, it's not really the repertoire or the composers that have inspired them to buy their ticket. And it leaves me to conclude that it's really more a sense of them wanting to experience the idea of old Australian music. And so that's become a central pillar around which I've tried to tailor my programs and promote my programs. But it does come, there is a catch. And the catch is, given the multi-layered and conflictual, and let's face it, sometimes barely existent versions of Australian history, which are carried around by the diverse people in Australian audiences today, is it really possible to work with some kind of assumed general knowledge in this field? And my quick answer is no, I don't think it is possible. Because if you come from First Nations community, or you're a recent immigrant, maybe you grew up in the bush, or you've spent many years at university, your version of Australian history is probably going to be very specific to your immediate community. So I've come to accept that my role as programmer is partially non-musical, insofar as it requires me to contextualize the repertoire with enough historical information to guide a unified listening experience. Because music is, after all, a language of emotion, and it's not a particularly good vehicle for historical detail. And so my recent experimentation in this area has taken the form of a sort of multimedia padding around performances and recordings. So I use text, artwork, images, costuming, videos, blogs, and venue staging in an effort to convey historical narrative and to develop a shared sense of musical meaning with diverse audiences. And I'll introduce you to a few of the projects that I'm talking about. Let's see if I can change screen. No, I can't. Beautiful. So the first project will look at the use of historical artworks and sound sampling to accompany music. The second looks at the tailoring of new images to accompany old music. And the third is the use of historical venues. So the first project, it comes from the Miegunyah Student Project Award, which I was granted this year. And I'll be presenting my final outcome for this project next week in Melbourne. So the project explores the use of art objects. Can I change screen? Yes. Mostly prints from Melbourne University's Grimwade Collection to enhance a listener's experience of historical Australian music. So this example on the right explains how I'll be doing a live performance at the Percy Granger Museum, and in this performance space with me, I'll have actual physical art objects from the Grimwade Collection. So there'll be 2 prints by Von Gerard, a sketch by Strutt, and a beautiful oil painting by Lambert. So it's kind of a reverse take on that scenario that we're usually relatively familiar with, whereby music is piped into gallery or exhibition spaces to accompany your viewing experience of artworks. In this case, the artworks are there to accompany the musical performance. And the other project for, again, the Miegunyah Project Award is a video, and this one is of digitized collection images, and they'll accompany 2 recorded tracks that I made of my PhD materials in March of this year, and we'll watch the video in a second. So in terms of the music, I constructed the instrumental suites that you'll hear from a Tasmanian music collection attributed to Alexander Lang. He was a Scotsman transported to Tasmania in 1813. And in the past, I've done a number of recordings of Scottish music for other albums without the Australian component. And I knew that there was absolutely no amount of stylistic interpretation or arrangement on my part, which could convey the level of historical detail which I wanted to attach to the chosen pieces from this collection, because I wanted the listener to come away with with a listening experience firmly rooted in not just Australia, but in Tasmania. And I wanted the listener to also come away with a sense of Lang's colourful life. He was quite a character. And so I asked friends to record extracts from his memoirs. So I had to choose them for their accent: Scots, Irishman, Frenchman, someone from Manchester. And I layered these with BBC sound samples of random noises, and also nature recordings done by Andrew Skeoch in Tasmania. So these created a sort of a sound vignette. And so if you like, the track that you'll listen to is already a curated experience of the music, given that it has voice and sound. And the art images that I've attached from the Grimwade are simply visual accompaniment. And for those of you who are well versed in Australian art and photography, you will probably immediately notice that not every image is a perfect fit within this new context. I'm simply using the images to advance Lang's narrative. So you'll see references to his early memories in the Scottish Army. You'll see his transport to Australia as a convict, his participation in the Black Wars with the Indigenous people of Tasmania, his deep love of the bush and his passion for music. A voice reads from his memoirs at one stage, and I've juxtaposed the horrible scenes of violence that he's describing with pompous martial airs from his collection. So even though the video may remind you of some kind of televised historical documentary, my hope is that you're still able to focus your attention principally on the music, and all of the rest is simply accompaniment. So let's have a listen.
On the 16th of October 1830, a force assembled at Orlands consisting of part of the 63rd and 57th Regiments, clergymen, doctors, surveyors, lawyers, clerks, shopkeepers, publicans, settlers, mechanics, ticket of leave men and assigned servants. The whole combined force consisted of about 1,500 strong. The Black Line
So as you can see, the video opens up some colonial wounds. It was impossible for me to ignore the fact that Lang had participated directly in massacres in Tasmania, because he had arrived at a time when white folk were the minority on the island, and died thinking that the Aboriginal population in his community was a phenomenon of the past. So given that I was trying to capture the sound world that he lived in, I looked for his music, the sounds of his environment, the sounds of the people that he had spoken with, but there was an enormous gap where First Nations voices should have been, and it wasn't up to me to fill that gap. It took me 2 years to find somebody who I could work with, and his name's James Howard. So he's a young Jadwa composer and songman, and he'll be adding his voice to the album by writing a reactionary response to the historical material involving Lang. And I'm currently looking at ways at being able to bring all of the multi-layered aspects of this project to life in a live performance context. So to my second point, which involves the creation or the tailoring of new images to accompany historical music projects. So many people in this room will know the difficulty of choosing a single image to associate with an historical program, be it for live performances or an album cover or both. Some repertoires have dozens of closely associated images of direct relevance. You might have paintings of the composer or places where the music was performed. You might have concert paraphernalia, but others have next to nothing, and that was the case with Lang. There was no portrait, no sketches of the places where he had lived, not even any sort of modern poster-worthy photographs of those areas, nothing which conveyed that sense of the historical aspects of the music that I wanted to portray. So in the past, I've frequently chosen to create my own album cover art as a way of gaining more control over that aspect of the visual narrative. Because I find that we are deeply visual people at the moment. It must something to do with how we interact with the internet. I never used to associate so much importance with, an album cover or a poster image, but these days I find that it's become really quite intrinsic to the way that people engage with music, these sort of iconic images that you associate with programs. So the image to the left, it represents a fellowship project that I did at the National Library of Australia, and it makes references to the themes of ocean life and voyage, which tie together many of the pieces on the album. The image to the right is set in the drawing room of Elizabeth Bay House in Sydney, which is where the album programmed was premiered in 2019. So it's the room itself that brings the European context to the project, but the bouquet of Australian flowers brings the Australian context, except for the proteas, and I apologize, I made a mistake. Last year, I experimented with another visual medium for my 19th century projects. There's a photographer who lives close by to me who specializes in wet plate photography. And I find that they make an interesting complement to historically informed performance practice in the sense that you get this sense of something old or ancient just through the use of old technology, but the image itself is from 2021, a bit like the use of a Baroque violin, but the performance is still from this year. So going to the effort of dressing as both a male and female violinist of the period made me realize two things about performance practice. Number one was that the little square of velvet, which the 19th century violinist whose collection and instrument I was playing used, so I've brought it along, that it works pretty well when you use it in association with a shirt and jacket, and his teacher included instructions on how to do that in his manual, but it really doesn't work at all when you're wearing a dress. And second, that it would have been quite hellish as a woman to travel in Australia as a female musician wearing that type of elaborate dress and the hat, which is why I opted for suits when Donald Nicholson and I toured the program for our Winter Garden Fantasias album recording last month, which brings me to my final point on focusing on the historicity of venue choice, where the performance venue itself brings an additional layer to the communication of historical narrative. So given that I've only got a few minutes left, I'll jump right into our the last video that I'm going to present to you. The video is a sequence of snippets of the same piece, but performed in a number of different venues. As any pianist in the room will know, it can be quite difficult to tour with a piano. And sometimes tuning up the old upright in the corner of a historical venue is the best option. And this is what we did for the first venue in Geelong. It's a National Trust house. We then go to an old hall in central Victoria. There's a fire crackling in the room. It was incredibly hot. The third venue is a private chapel. We jump then to the recital centre and we finish in the new Prudence Meyer studio of the Melbourne Conservatorium. So this is, the piece itself belongs to the owner of the shoulder rest and the violin that I'm playing in that image. Ta-da!
Thank you. So interesting. I wonder if, as the chair, I can ask the first question. What led you to Alexander Lang? I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit. I've done a bit of research as well. He's a very fascinating character.
Okay, nice. You have to compare notes. When I started my PhD, I was first of all looking at all the available Scottish material in Australian libraries, archives and personal collections. And when it came to manuscript collections, there weren't actually that many. There were three sort of big collections, and they're the three that I've settled on, Lang, Findlay and the Bailey collection. So I guess, you know, had I had a choice of a couple of dozen, he might not have ended up being on my list of, you know, focus composers. But he's, as you say, he's a very interesting character, and it's quite a comprehensive collection. So, and not that much has been done on the collection, a little bit by the folk circles in Tasmania, but not, not a lot of dissection has happened sort of in the art music world.
Yeah, it's such a great way of conveying an archive. I love seeing the video. Any other questions? Is there a wireless mic that's coming around? Yes, yeah.
Where did they come from, and who was able to get them?
So I was playing on the same violin for both of those recordings, and the violin is actually, it belongs to the Bailey family. So the Bailey collection goes back 4 generations of violinists back to the 18th century in Scotland. And the 5th generation, sort of coming towards our time, he lives up in the Blue Mountains, just down the road from where I grew up. And I just had an idea once I started looking at the collection that I should see whether or not any family members, you know, lived close by. And when I went and had tea and cake with him, he made me the most incredible gift, which was 3 violins and 9 bows belonging to his dad. So yeah, so that was the family's violin, and it hadn't, apart from changing the strings and fixing a crack, I haven't touched anything. So that's the way that, you know, it was put into the case when he died in 1954 and not touched since then. So it has, I find, quite a gorgeous, grainy, more soft than the sort of the sound of a modern violin that's the desirable sound for a 21st century violinist. When I was playing at the end with the Steinway piano, it was a bit of a battle, volume-wise, but we fixed that post-prod. Yeah. Anyone else?
Oh, yeah.
That was really interesting today, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that, you know, the images you show as part of Lane's work, you know, and particularly the Black Wars one. And I was just, you know, I think it's a really interesting way to deal with history like that. Another question is, I think it's something that's a real challenge of dealing with music in that period. I guess my question is that a challenge that you found particularly with Lang, given his personal history, or is that something you think applies to?
I think it's quite, yeah. Well, as soon as you're in the 19th century, it was a war zone all the time. It was a war zone in Australia, it was a war zone in Europe, and it just struck me more and more as I looked through his family history, the fact that as a teenager he'd been to war. How would that feel? You know, I've got a teenager, you know, how would I feel if, you know, my child were at war? And what sort of memories of conflict would that person take with them being transported as a convict into a foreign land? You know, that type of, you know, you harbor violence like that, and it ends up affecting you as an adult. And so when I learnt that he had been involved in the Black Line, I guess I think it's important to understand that he had been a soldier, not necessarily of his own will, and how, you know, those two stories interlink. You sort of, it's important to not take individual facts out of someone's life without understanding the broader context, in no way to justify it, but just to sort of understand the layers of someone's life. And it became a really big thing for me looking at Lang, because there are lots of family descendants and they're all looking into the genealogy of his life. And so, it just felt impossible to record his music and then not have some of those details attached. It felt like I wasn't doing him a service or doing that period of time a service. I couldn't disassociate the music from all of that history. So it's a bit of a weird, a bit of a quirky outcome, I find, that album, you know, being all those, the sound samples and the voices. Sometimes I feel as if I've created a little bit like, Do you know Old Sydney Town? Did you ever go there in the 90s? Yeah, I kind of feel like I've created a musical version of that, which, you know, I would have really not believed that I would have ever done that in my life. But yeah, it's for multiple reasons. And yeah, I'm not entirely embarrassed about it. I'm just taking stock of what I've created. I don't know. I've only got, you know, my kid's impression, like my childhood impression of what Sydney Town was. Now that I think back on it, you know, you could never create Old Sydney Town now. It'd be too out there. But yeah, the 90s allowed for it. I don't know, mixed feelings.
Okay, we might move on. Thank you very much. Fascinating work.